started. Hey everyone, my name is Paul BAMSON. I used to go here. Not too long ago, I got my undergraduate in architecture here and then my graduate in landscape architecture doing the 5+2, which I now realize is a 5+1, so lucky you guys. But take advantage of that opportunity. It's definitely paid off in my professional career at SOM, which is where I work at now in Chicago. A little bit about me. I was born in Nigeria, but grew up in Nashville. And I was always good at math and art, which is why I started studying architecture. And that love has now grown to expand to more things, which includes the environment and landscape, which is why I studied that. And now I'm at urban planning at SOM. So I'm looking at the intersections of architecture and landscape, not necessarily getting into the details of putting doors and windows here or planning the space, but really how the massing of the buildings and the open space of landscape come together in a city and really creating systems there. So about You're Doing It Wrong. It's a tutorial series that I started here because I was always the guy that people would come to when they needed help in any software. So I wanted to create a series where I can basically just download the information I know into a workshop that is recorded and uploaded online for resources for students and professionals. And so I'm actually also a part of the INOMA's Professional Development Committee, where I'm actually running more workshops there. Because believe it or not, professionals still don't know a lot about software because they typically use what they learned in school and they don't have time to learn additional software. So it's important while you're here to learn as much as you can and to absorb as much as you can now. So it's much easier when you get into the profession and you've got to balance work and life and bills and kids and all that stuff. So I believe a designer should be versed in all tools available to him or her, so they're never bottlenecked by the lack of knowledge of any specific tool, so be in the know. So today's session will be on the intersection of Photoshop and Illustrator and how to use them together to make awesome drawings. You'll learn how to work with raster graphics. You'll learn about an integrated workflow, plans and renderings, vector graphics and the difference between the two and how you can really use them together. So software in this session, again, Photoshop and Illustrator. Okay, I always do this on every session. It's important that you're understanding fundamentally what you're actually manipulating when you're doing drawings and working on graphics. And there are two major formats that you're working on. The first one are raster files. And rasters are pixels. And a pixel is a small, tiny square of color information. And when you get enough of these squares together, you can pose an image. Raster files are great because they're small, they're easy to compute. But the main limitation of raster graphics is that they're limited. And there's a fixed number. So if you lose resolution, you can never gain it back, although that's not as true anymore with AI, and that's a whole different discussion. So the higher you start, the better off you're going to be. And that's what makes it different from vector graphics. And vector graphics are actually mathematical equations that your computer runs. And so vector graphics are infinitely scalable. They can be as big as a billboard or as small as a quarter, and they'll always remain sharp. But the difference is that they are more computationally advanced because your computer is actually calculating the vectors every second, every millisecond. So that's the difference between the two, and they require different software to manipulate properly, which is why it's important to understand how you can use Photoshop, which is mainly raster graphics, and Illustrator, which is mainly vector graphics, and use them together. So in this session, we'll be learning and talking about both. So let's talk about PPI versus DPI. These two terms are often used interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. They do not represent the same thing. So here's the difference between the two. PPI stands for pixels per inch. And that's basically another way of saying resolution. So your computer screens are probably 1080p or 4K if you're lucky. That basically just means the number of pixels that comprise the screen. So how many little tiny squares that represent a color are packed in your screen. Now PPI stands for how many pixels per real world inch. So even though my phone is the same resolution as my computer, my phone has a higher PPI because the pixels are packed in much closer together. So images will look sharper on my phone than they will on my computer. So that's just the difference between the two. Even though the resolution is the same, their PPI is different. So you can have an iPhone that's, has a resolution of 800 PPI, which seems low, but because they're so close together, it still looks sharp. Now that's different from DPI, which stands for dots per inch. That's related to printing. So every printer, in order to create an image on a piece of paper, it's actually laying a series of dots that are very close together. And because they're so close together, you can't tell the difference. But if you were to take a microscope and really zoom in on your print, you'll see those little dots. And so the more dots you have, the higher resolution your print will be. Most printers have the ability to go really high DPI, so up to 1200 or even 2000 DPI. But anything that you're working on, anything over 300 DPI or 300 PPI is overkill, right? So 400, 500, 600, your printers are not most likely going to even reach that resolution. And so your computer's working much harder than it has to. So 300 is like the sweet spot. Your computer's only put out 72 in terms of what you see on your screen. So I wouldn't go any lower than like 150, but just note that 150 to 300 is like the sweet spot in terms of PPI. And then when you're printing, 300 DPI is like perfect. Does that make sense? The difference between the two? Very important to understand the fundamentals. RGB and CMYK. So this is also a very important distinction when working with raster graphics. RGB is a color composition that's additive. So meaning it's combining red, green, and blue to create every color in the color spectrum. And when you bring all those colors together at 100%, you get white. When you take all those colors away, you get black. So every color that you're looking at is a composition of those three colors when it's digital, when you're looking at a screen. So all of your screens are using RGB to display the image. So if you're creating a graphic that is meant to be viewed on a screen, that's meant to be viewed digitally, you should be using RGB color format in Illustrator and Photoshop. If you're creating something that's meant to be printed, you should be working in CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is another way of saying black, right? It's subtractive. So by taking those colors away, you then create other colors. And that's important for printing and pigment. So real world colors, that's what you should be using CMYK. But unfortunately, for all of us, we're creating graphics that are often viewed on a screen and printed. So what do you do in that case? Well, there are ways to get around this. Oftentimes, I prefer working in RGB. It's just easier to remember 3 numbers that represent a color than 4. But there are ways that you convert between the two to maintain color. And that's the ICC profile. And we'll talk about that when we're exporting some images. If you click retain ICC profile, it will look, when you're converting from RGB to CMYK, it will look as close as possible to the difference. But that's the main difference between RGB. RGB screen, digital, CMYK, physical, print. All right, so let's talk about Photoshop and workflows. So there are 2 major types of Photoshop workflows, no matter what you're creating in Photoshop. There's a destructive workflow, which is another way of saying permanent modification of pixels. A lot of Photoshop newbies are using this workflow format. And basically what it means is that you're cutting out every image that you're using and then using the composition of cutting out to create your final image. And that's fine. You'll get to the result that you want. But let's say you want to go back and make a change. Well, you have to cut out the whole thing again. So it's a destructive workflow because you're permanently modifying those pixels. So it's actually a workflow that we'll want to avoid altogether for the rest of time. So you want to actually use a non-destructive workflow or temporary and adjustable modifications to pixels. So any change that you make is easily turn offable and turn onable, or it becomes a layer that you can toggle on and off. If you make a mistake, it's easy. You can actually make a modification to that layer. So it's a workflow that's actually flexible, which means that if you come back to a drawing that you've done 3 months ago, you can pick up right where you left off and you don't have to do any additional work to make changes. So this is a workflow that will change the way you use Photoshop forever. So what is the difference between the two visually? So destructive workflows are like this. So the composite image is going to be the same for both, right? This grid of squares. But with a destructive workflow, what you're doing for each one is you're cutting it out. So you probably grabbed in a bigger image and then you cut out that square. And then you cut out this square. And then you cut out this square. And then you're composing them together, right? But if you want to make a change to that square, because there's content in here that you cut out, you have to bring it back in and do it again, or you need to do undo several times. So let's not do that workflow anymore. Let's switch to a non-destructive workflow and start using masks. So masks allow you to selectively show and selectively hide content that you're using to create your images. So the image is still the same, but how you get there is flexible. So let's say there is a part of this image that I want to show again. I can do that because the information is still there. It's not gone, it's just hidden. Now this workflow does make your files bigger, but I would rather have a bigger file that I can change later than a tiny merged file that I then have to redo again if I want to make a change. So this is a workflow for ultimate flexibility. So let's say you have a drawing that you're developing for the whole semester and it's May and you're trying to put it into your portfolio, but you need to make some changes to match the way you're working in your portfolio. Well, if everything is nice, cut out and flattened, then you have to do the drawing again. Let's not do that. Let's have a workflow that's flexible. So we'll talk a lot about this going forward and actually show you some examples of how you can use it. So that's layer masks. It's non-destructive. Okay, let's talk about vectors. So what is a vector, right? Like I said again, vectors are mathematically computed. So there are multiple ways to define a vector, but the two that are most important are either it's starting at a single point and it's going in a direction for a certain length that comprises a vector, or it's a connection between 2 points in space. So every vector you've ever seen uses either one of these computational methods to create it visually. And this is very important when you're modeling in Rhino or Revit, because you're working in 3D space. And so the vectors that you're creating have all of that information embedded in it. So a line that you see on your computer is never just a line. It's a composition of a lot of data points that you can extract. So in my Grasshopper sessions, and there's some videos I have online, I teach you how to extract that information, right? Because vectors, have points along them that you can extract and things like that. So there's lots of cool things you can do with vectors because it is data driven. So using vectors in Illustrator, there are a few major ways that vectors are composed, and they all start with the anchor point, which is just like a point in any other program. It contains no information other than I am here in this place. But when you connect two anchor points together, you get paths, and paths can be straight, can be connections, can be curved in a number of different complex shapes, and how you modify those can really affect how your graphics look. And the more anchor points you have, the more complex the vector, the heavier the file. So you need to figure out ways to manage how big your files are getting and how quick they run. And of course, when you get a closed path, you create a shape, which then creates a fill. And fills can be any color you want. You can actually modify the fills and the strokes differently, and we'll look at that later on as well. So there's lots of ability to modify the way your vectors look. So the age-old question, which software do I use, Illustrator or InDesign? Does anyone know the correct answer? Ding, 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 both. So that is a false dichotomy. Both programs do different things. So yes, they both have the ability to modify vector graphics, but Illustrator is far stronger. It's like trying to cut a steak with a trimmer or a small paring knife, right? Paring knives are great for cutting apples, but they're not great for cutting steaks. So use the proper tool for the proper task. So InDesign is for boards, books, portfolios, publications, flyers, posters. Illustrator's for actually creating your vector graphics. So creating your renderings and your plans and your drawings or your posters. And so there's definitely overlap for sure, which is why the question even exists. But use the proper tool for the proper job. And Photoshop is for images. It's for raster. It's not for your vector files. So don't ever export a final drawing from Photoshop with vector line work, because then the line work becomes rasterized and you're defeating the purpose. So we'll talk about that too. But it is the wrong question. It's important to use both and to understand both for what they do. So Illustrator is great for vector graphics, logos, drawings, typography, boards, illustrations, layouts, a number of things. But it is not for portfolios. Please do not make your portfolio in Illustrator. You are doing it super wrong when you do that, right? You're working way harder than you have to. Portfolios in InDesign, but the drawings that you put in InDesign can come from Illustrator. Don't do that. Okay. All right. So artboards. So understanding like what you're working in is also very important. Illustrator uses artboards. You can make as many artboards as you want in the broader canvas that comes with Illustrator, versus Photoshop, which you can only work on one canvas at a time per file. And then InDesign uses pages, and those pages can combine to become spreads, which is very important when you are making books in portfolios and publications. Okay, and then file types, and then we'll jump in. The almighty DWG, any respectable CAD program exports and imports DWGs. That includes Illustrator. So you can import your DWGs into Illustrator and then modify your drawings that way. Very important. You can also export DWGs and then bring them back into CAD and Rhino and Revit. So you can actually start creating workflows by using the proper file formats that you're working with. So let's jump in. I have been modeling a building in Rhino that we're going to use as our main template for the workshop here, just to show you the complexities that you can use when you're using both Photoshop and Illustrator to create your graphics. This is actually a building that I designed in Grasshopper completely, using very simple geometry from the start. And that workshop is online and is available to watch. I highly recommend you do. But, of course, every drawing starts with making a named view, which is really important. So if you need to add additional things to your drawing, you can. Can anyone tell me why this is not the best view to use? Or what's wrong with this particular view? Yes, right? You've got diverging verticals, right? So I've made another one using 2-point perspective that does straighten my verticals. So this is a much better view automatically by doing that. So I've made 2D. I'm going to go ahead and import it into Illustrator, which is where I start every single drawing. And Illustrator is kind of my home base for drawing compositions. So let's go ahead and bring this into Illustrator. So I've made the 2D. And I'm very strict with my layers. So every single different object is on a different layer. My panels are on a layer. My glazing's on a layer. My floors are on a layer. My structure is on a layer. Please get used to using multiple layers for a few reasons. Number one, it's easier on you. You can hide things instead of clicking every single thing you want to hide because everything's on the same layer. Please stop doing that. I know some of you in this room do that. And also because if someone else looks at my file, I want them to be able to know what's going on as well, right? And that's a very important for collaboration in your groups, but also when you get into the professional world and you are working with 5 or 6 people on a team for a project. So please get used to using layers on everything. If it's different than its neighbor object, they should be on 2 different layers. And that's also important for materiality when you're doing renderings. So layers are super important. Okay, so I'm going to export here to AI. All right, so let's bring it in. So again, like I said, Illustrator is my home base for drawings. It's where all my vectors will remain until I hit export. What I'm doing with Photoshop is then saying, okay, I've got my vectors in Photoshop, but I'm still going to use those vectors as references inside Photoshop to make my textures. And then I'll bring those textures into Illustrator. So let's go ahead and open it. Yeah. I'm going to put this in a separate layer so those layers remain separate. Because if the layers in Illustrator are the same or named the same, they will merge. And that might be okay for what you want to do, but sometimes it won't. And if you also want Illustrator to remember the layers for copies that you make, you'll click on these 3 bars right here and click Paste Remembers Layers. Super important. So if you've been frustrated because you brought in layers and they all collapse, that's the reason why. So I'm going to bring ground into my other file and line them up. Paste in place. And then I will line them up using the rectangle. Always export a viewport rectangle. That's like super handy for lining up things after the fact. So I'm actually going to scale this. So I won't easily be able to just use paste in place, but with the viewport rectangle, I can use that to line things up. As long as I've made a named view, and it is exactly the same. So always make named views as well. So we'll make this 11 by 17. And I will scale this up here with my width. You can modify the size of things, and I recommend using this quite a bit. If you don't see these in your Illustrator, it's probably because your resolution is too high. And the weird thing about Illustrator is it'll like cut off most of these tools and you won't ever see them until you like expand it and then bring it over. So if you have a high resolution screen, if you want to see all of your modifying options, you go over to Edit Preferences and go over to, I think it's under, let's hit General. It's under Performance. There's a button that you hit that makes it high res. And I haven't done it in a while, so I forgot what it was. Scaling, UI scaling. Okay, so here it is. Under user interface, I have it set to small, so I see everything. So if your eyes are good, and most of your eyes are, then you can change the settings here. So you can make sure that you do see all of your options, because it doesn't give you a drop down to say, okay, anything that's not seen, give me a drop down, which is weird. They need to fix that. But anyway, so I'm gonna set this width to 17. And then right now it's a little off. So I'm actually gonna place it to where X is 0. So it's exactly where it needs to be along the edge here. And this box right here is also very handy. I know it's probably really small to see, but you can modify what Illustrator is referencing in terms of when you type in a number. So right now I set it to the side here and I set X to 0. So it moved it to the artboard 0. If I had the middle selected, then that says 8.5 because that's 17 divided by 2. So I can still get to the exact same result. I would just have to do some math in my head. So pay attention to these guys. They're great for scaling and positioning things on your artboard. All right, so now I'm ready for prep and ready to go into Photoshop. I've got all my layers here. They're a mess because we did make 2D. So I would personally go through and clean up all the layer names, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just keep the names as they are. But the most important one, structure, is invisible, so I'll just hide structure for now, since it's not a layer that will really make lots of impact. Floors, you can barely see floors. Core is invisible. But I have the option to do this because they're in different layers. So that's like the huge advantage for that. So most of these can go away. Solid is important because those are my front panels. Oh, that's the clipping plane as well. So we don't need clipping plane stuff. So really all I need are the surrounding buildings. Scale figures there. There's the main facade. Okay, so I'm gonna hide all that stuff. Okay, so now I'm ready for Photoshop. And it looks like my ground is also cutting through here. So I'm gonna actually cut this guy out. I'm gonna use this, I'm gonna hit C for cut, and then I'm going to select between two. Right now the color is black of the layer, so I can't see what I'm selecting. So let's change that to red. So I double clicked on the layer and changed it to a different color, so I can actually see what I'm working with here. Let's do the same for the ground. Again, I would take the time to clean all of this up after the Make 2D so that it's easier for me to work on later. So now the ground is cut. I can delete that portion that's going through the building. That line can go away too. Okay. And we'll worry about the others later. All right, so now I'm ready to import into Photoshop. But before I do that, I am going to modify my artboard. I did make it 11 by 17, but I kind of want it to work with it as closely to the rectangle as the viewport rectangle as possible. So I'm going to modify my artboard that way. And then I will hide the rectangles so they're not interfering with my drawing. Same thing with this ground element here. We'll just delete that line, delete that line, delete that line, and extend this all the way to the edge, which will come important later. Cool. All right, so let's do it. So now this is ready to bring into Photoshop. Let's bring those buildings back. Okay, good. So we don't want any unnecessary overlap. So now the vectors are ready to go for Photoshop. And in fact, I'm actually going to make them slightly thinner. That way, when I'm doing selections, I get as much of the elements as I can get. Because when we start going in and doing selections with the Magic Wand tool to grab certain areas, it will be important for us to be able to differentiate certain things and pay attention to the width of our vectors when we're selecting. And I might actually do this in pieces. So for example, right now I want to make sure that I can easily select my glazing separate from my panels. So I'm thinking ahead while I'm creating my export files. If I do them all together, they will act as the same geometry, and there's a lot of geometry here. So it's also about managing the graphics resources that you're working with. So I'm actually going to do an export like this, where I have the ground off and have other elements off. So I'm going to have a layer that's just my line work for the panels. And then I'll have a layer that's just a line work of my glazing. And then I'll bring in the surrounding geometry as well. So let's do that. So export as, or actually I can save a copy. And I'll save that copy as a PDF. I'll create a folder for just my exports, so it doesn't like cloud up my final folder. So I'm also like hyper organized, which saves me time later when I'm trying to find something and it's not part of every single file I've ever exported. So file structure is important too. So we'll call this panel PDF. And I'll turn off all of these settings because I really only need it for line work. It'll say, hey, you will no longer be able to edit this in Illustrator. But again, it's a save as copy, so it doesn't matter. So you'll see in this workshop that it's like more than half of the workshop is set up, and then it's just fast for the rest of it. So that's typically how I like to work, is I like to take the time to set things up to be fast later. And I'm okay with taking the time for setup. You can, in fact, bring in AI files into Photoshop. It's not super successful. They tend to get bogged down, so I always use PDFs because it's faster. But I will be bringing my PSD into Illustrator. So I will show you why that's important and how that's part of the integrating between the two programs. All right. So now the surrounding areas. Ooh, this could be a good time to show that too. So let's do that. So real fast, I do want to bring in the surrounding, but I do want the file to remain light. So I'm not going to bring in all this complex geometry twice. So I'm actually going to create a merged like graphic that's the outer profile. And what would most of you guys do to get the outer profile of an object? Like literally the outer profile. You would trace it, right? But let's say it's complex geometry. You're going to spend 30 minutes tracing all that geometry when you don't have to. So here's a technique that you will cry because it would have saved you hours late in the past. And you're thinking about all the time that you wasted tracing all of these objects when you don't have to. Oh no, that's not what we want. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create a live paint object. Do you guys know what live paint is in Illustrator? Okay, here's how to use it like way more advanced. So I'm going to copy both of these layers. I never make a live paint of my original geometry. I always make a copy. Because when you make live paint, they all become one group. It collapses the layer structure. And in order to edit the vectors, you have to go in and select the lines selectively. I only use live paint for the background fill color. So I always create a copy of the geometry first. And I'm going to go into live paint, object, live paint, make. If there's a lot of geometry, it'll say, hey, there's a lot of geometry, but oftentimes it's fine. Then what I'm going to do is get rid of the stroke and fill it. So I'm just going to flip the colors here. And so everything went black because the lines are black and the fill is black, so you can't see anything. But I'm going to use the live paint bucket, which is usually the second tool under shape builder tool. And I'm going to get rid of the color around the surroundings. So now it already looks like a solid object, but it's not yet. So what we'll do now is expand it, and expand just collapses the live paint structure back into normal shapes. What's cool is that there are elements here that were not solid, but now are. So if I wanted to then say, okay, I want the windows to become a color, and I didn't want to go in and trace in every single one, now you don't have to, right? So there are tons of advantages of using live paint in this way. For example, if I were to just create another copy for example reasons, and then what I'll do is I will ungroup them. So now, like, these are elements now that are solid shapes. So super handy for creating your vector graphics in that way. But in this case, what we're going to do is just merge them all together. So some of the greatest set of tools that Illustrator has are called the Pathfinder tools. Anyone familiar with Pathfinder? Okay, if you're not, whoa, you've been missing out, man. Okay, so Pathfinder. So I would dock it. Like, if you don't have it, you go over to Window, and all the tools that you are not using are here. So if you don't have these tools, please bring them in. Pathfinder's down here. It has a lot of tools like Union, Subtract Front, Get the Intersection, Divide. It's great for manipulating vector shapes. In this case, we're going to use Union, and we're going to merge all that geometry into one. And now it's just literally one solid shape that we can then flip. And I'll turn off the other stuff so you can see, like, it's done. And I didn't have to trace it all. So yes, it took time because I was explaining it, but it's super fast if you know exactly how to do it. And if you need to see it again, we can talk later. But the whole reason I did that was just so I had a solid version of the shape of the building so that it'll be important when I'm trying to select certain things. So we'll bring the ground back in, and now I'm ready to export this as a PDF for Photoshop. We'll call this surroundings. All right, so now let's go into Photoshop, and there's some things that are important to note when working with files together. So as soon as that's done saving, oh, let's actually finish. Okay, so when you bring in PDFs into Photoshop, it's important that you select the right settings. So I'm going to drop this in here. Before I hit OK, I want to make sure I've got the right crop. If this is set at the default, which is usually bounding box, the actual canvas will be as small as the actual vector sizes are, and I will lose the rectangular information from Illustrator, and I'll have to then place it if I bring it back in. So I'm actually going to use Media Box, which will maintain the aspect ratio of the image that you bring in. So that's like super handy, saves you a ton of time right there. Everything else I'm going to leave the same. You can see that my resolution is at 300 ppi. So I'm going to leave it at 300 ppi because I like working high, and then if I need to, reduce later. I don't like working low and then needing the resolution that will never be attainable again, later effect. So I always work at least 300. And right now my color mode is in RGB because this is only going to be seen digitally. I'm not going to be printed. So again, things that I've talked about earlier, coming back. Hit OK. And then I'm just going to bring in the other layers that I was making. That took all the time for setup. So let's do that. So panel, bring that in. Drop it in place. Hit OK. Actually, did you guys catch it? What I did wrong? Okay, let's not do that again. Photoshop. And then Media Box. So it comes in exactly in place. Enter. And then surroundings, PDF, bring that in. Photoshop. Media Box. Enter. All right, and then I'm going to create a background so I can see what I'm doing. So, okay, so the tool I just clicked on down here, there are several tools here. You'll see FX. You'll see the Layer Masks tool, which we'll get into soon. Adjustment layers, which are exactly the same as image adjustments. These are destructive. They make permanent changes to the pixels you're working on that you have to either have made a copy, you have to hit undo, or start over. But these are actually layers, which you can turn on and off. So same tools that you can turn on and off, like huge deal, like in terms of workflow. In this case, we'll just use solid color, and we'll make it white, not brown. And now that's going to become my background layer. And you can actually see another like graphic right next to it. That's the mask for the solid color fill. And so this mask right here is all white because it's saying show everything that you can show in that layer. And we'll talk about that more very soon. So right now this is my background, so we'll have that there. I've now got all of my reference geometry. So now I can create my masks, put my textures in for Photoshop, and then I'm actually going to bring the PSD back into Illustrator and just have it sitting behind all my vector line work. So I can do all my textures in Photoshop, And as I'm saving in Photoshop, it's automatically updating in Illustrator, and I can do the things I need to do in Illustrator. So you're working together. So let's do that, and then we can actually start going in and doing textures. So again, lots of setup, but it will pay off. So I'm going to hit File, Save, and I'm just going to save it as a normal PSD. So we'll call this Render Textures, and save it in the right layer. And we'll save it here in the main folder. And you can see ICC profile. I do want that to remain checked. So it will maintain the conversion of RGB to CMYK if necessary. So ICC profile, whenever you export, make sure you check that option. All right, so now I'm going to bring my PSD back into Illustrator. Oops. Actually, I'm going to use the place feature. That tends to work well too. Drag and drop is kind of finicky. So place, file place, and then I'll place the PSD. I'll keep it linked so whenever I save in Photoshop, it will update in Illustrator. I'll hit OK or place. Place, and then I'll just use these features. So 0x, 0y, done. And then place it in its own layer and put it at the very bottom and then lock it. So I never really touch it again. So I'll call this PSD and then lock the layer. And now whenever I do an export, let's say I save an edit. So let's say I make a quick object here. So let's say I fill this with that color. And I hit Control S for save. Then Illustrator will say, hey, a file has changed. Do you want to update it? Yes, say yes. And the change will then be brought into Illustrator. So this is the workflow that will save you like tons of time. And you can use the strengths of each program. So I can continue going in, making my line weight awesome. And I can also continue working on my textures in Photoshop. And they're all working together. So the question, I've still got my vectors in here. What do I do when I've got all my textures? And now am I going to have two overlapping vectors? So you just have to remember, turn off your vector reference layers in Photoshop before you hit save so they don't overlap with your vector ones in Illustrator. So that solves the problem. But you just have to be mindful about that. All right, so let's make our masks and make this non-destructive. So this is all my line work. I don't want crowding of all my layers. So I'm going to select them all and hit the folder icon to group them. And I'll just call this line work. Again, please name your layers. Layer 32 is not acceptable. Just name them so you know what they are. It'll save you a lot of headache in the future. So I can turn that on and off whenever I'm exporting. I'll turn it off, export my textures, and they'll be there. Okay, so let's create our masks. So let's do the ground and sky first, since those are pretty easy. I'll turn off the, that name didn't come in, so I'll just rename it YDIW render, because it was the first file I brought in, so typically it doesn't bring the name in. Glazing. PDF. Okay. And I'll turn it back into a smart object, which is important for certain things. Like if you're transforming an object and it's a smart object, it will remember how it was transformed, and you can continue transforming it after the fact. Versus when it's a dumb object, and when you transform it and then you leave it, the transform window like resets to rectilinear. So make it a smart object if you want to have the freedom to manipulate the exact same way later. So that's handy. Okay, what was I doing next? Right, so let's make our first masks. So I'll turn on surroundings and we'll use that for sky. So I'm going to use the magic wand tool like normal, and I'm going to select the certain areas that will be important for this. Uh-oh. Is there a break? And it should not have selected everything. Oh, contiguous is off. Okay. So when you have the magic wand tool, there are a couple of options here. There's anti-alias. There's contiguous, which means if it's checked, it will, once it hits a boundary, it will stop its selection. If contiguous is checked off, it will select any pixels in the entire canvas that have the same color. So when it had it off, it selected all of the white, which in some cases you want, but in some cases you don't when you're trying to select certain specific boundaries. So have that checked, and then sample all layers. When this is checked, it will look at every single layer for the selection that are on. So sometimes there are elements in one layer and elements in another layer, and you don't want to take the time to merge them or redraw them to close a shape, for example. You can have turn on select all layers, and then it will treat all the layers as a single boundary. So another handy tool. There's so much you can do, and it takes a long time to learn it all, but it's important to take the time to do so. So, okay, so there must be a break in here as well, a gap. Yes, right there. Okay, so please do a better job than I've done in closing these. So I could go in and modify that layer, but it's a smart object, so I'd have to make it rasterized. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer and just fill that gap, and then check select all or sample all layers so it recognizes that gap is now closed, which is just a quick way to get around that little error I was talking about. So I was hoping for a chance to get to show this. So we'll use that, we'll fill it. Alt backspace will fill with whatever color is in the front, and Control backspace will autofill with whatever color is in the back. So use those hotkeys. So I just hit Control backspace and it filled in automatically with the front color. And now when I select my sky, it should work. Turn on sample all layers, and then go back in. Select that area, good. That's now closed. Select this guy, good. And then select this back sky here. Okay, so now I've got my selection done. So I'm gonna go in to solid color. And the reason why I'm using solid color is because I don't yet have a texture to apply this mask to. So I'm just using this as a placeholder to create my mask. And so I'll do this for all the respective elements of the drawing. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because I'm doing the selection once, so I never have to do it again. Like my sky selection is ready to go, my mask has been created. So what does that mean? So if you see next to the sky mask I have here, I'm gonna call this sky mask to stay organized. So the object is literally just a black color that fills the entire canvas, and it will always be a black color that fills the entire canvas. But with my mask, I'm only showing it in these regions. So when I actually look at my mask, which is right next to it, if I hold Alt and click on it, you'll see where my mask has been created. So any objects in white will show through the mask. Any objects in black will be hidden. So I'm going to create a mask for all the different categories of my drawing. So my windows, my panels, my building facades, my ground. So now those masks have been created. So when I bring textures in, I don't have to modify the texture itself. I can literally just place it next to the mask and it's done. So we'll get to that too. So much we'll get to. So anyway, let's say I want to make a change. So let's say this building is now lower, right? And I need to come back to this Photoshop drawing and make a change. Well, I can do that. I can go in to the mask and fill that region with white. And now whatever was hidden here will now show through. So let's undo that. And exit the mask. So hold Alt and click on the mask again to go back to the drawing. So I know the colors are the same, so it might be confusing. So I'll show you some options if that doesn't make sense. So let's make our other masks. So we've got sky. Let's go ahead and do the ground. And I'm going to actually keep on sample all layers here. Ground mask. And I'll show you something that's pretty critical for layer management and the integration of Photoshop and Illustrator. So I'm going to turn off everything else. So what do you notice between the two masks? Right? I've got a gap here, and that gap was the stroke itself, right? And that's why in Illustrator, I made the stroke as thin as possible. But let's say my stroke needs to change in the drawing itself. I'm now probably, if I have a thick stroke at the beginning, I'm gonna have a thin gap where the textures aren't. So how do you combat that problem from the start so it never shows up later? So you can actually expand and contract the selections that you make. So if I go in and I reselect the mask by holding Control and clicking on the mask, that will automatically redo the selection. Oh wait, I was not holding Control. That was a different button. Right. Hold Control, select the mask. Now anything that was in the mask has auto selected. So another way that's saving you time later. I'm gonna go over to Select up here and go over to Modify. And Select Modify will then give me the option to expand the selection by a set number of pixels, contract the selection by a select number of pixels, or feather, which will make it soft. So if you're doing like a selection of a person and you don't want it to be a hard selection line, you can use feather to soften the boundary between the two selections. In this case, I want to expand it by a pixel. So I'm going to hit 1 and hit OK. And now my selection is bigger. And then I can just fill in with white on the mask, which will fill in with black. So Control Backspace. And now that mask has been expanded. So now if the texture will always sit behind the vector line work, right? So you don't ever have to worry about that in Illustrator. But now you know that if you make changes or the stroke of your line work changes, you know that you'll be fine with the texture behind it. So I'm going to do the same thing with the ground. So I'm going to reselect it. So Control, click on the mask, then go into Select, Modify, Expand by 1 pixel, and then Control Backspace. Because white is the back color, I can flip it with using X. It'll flip the foreground and background color. And then click on the mask and then fill in with white. So Control Backspace. And now that gap is either significantly smaller or it's gone. It's okay if it's still small because eventually there'll still be a stroke there. So I just know that the chances of me getting a weird gap because I changed the thickness of my line weight in Illustrator is now greatly minimized. So I will do that each time I create a mask. So let's go ahead and create the rest of them super fast so we can start getting into texture manipulation. So I'll turn on my reference geometry. I'll create a mask for my surrounding buildings for the different faces. So I'll do a side face and then I'll do a face that's facing me and then a face that's not facing me layer. So we'll call this, we'll select that guy and then we'll select the side faces 1, 2. And you'll see that Rhino does this automatically when it changes the shading of an object you're rotating. It's like picking a face and making it slightly darker or lighter, which is important for legibility and contrast. So we'll fake that in Photoshop. So we'll call this solid color. Actually, I forgot to expand it. I'll expand it now before I even do the selection. So I'll go over to, wait, did I lose my selection? Yes, I did. But I'm going to go back to history and regain my selection so I don't have to do it again. So history is also handy. If this is not available, please bring it back in. Select, modify, expand by 1 pixel from the get, and then create my solid color. So I know my mask has now been created. We'll make it black, and then we'll name it side face. And we'll do one for the front face. Expand, modify. 1 pixel, solid color fill. This is also a good way to note what masks have been created. So you can see like, okay, now I only have a couple masks to go for the drawing. So we'll call this front face. And then I'll actually put these in their own folder so they're out of the way. I can turn them on and off quickly. So we'll call this mask. I'll put that up there. And now let's work on our panels. So I've got a lot of panels here. So we'll turn off the surroundings. We'll turn on panels. Line work is thin. And in some line works, they're not closed. So I'm not going to worry about like the undersides because we don't have the time, but I would account for those later on. I'd probably export the panels as a Make2D separately so they are like fully closed instead of exporting them all at once, which will then create the gaps. So again, think super far ahead when you're making drawings. But in this case, we'll just worry about the front faces for now. One thing I could do is go in and select each face, but I'm not going to do that. That's going to take forever. I'm going to turn off sample all layers. And I'm going to go in and actually select the surrounding area. So everything that is not in the surrounding area will remain unselected. And then what I'm going to then invert the selection. So right click, select inverse, and now all the panels are selected and I can create a mask and move on. So mask, we'll call this panels. Again, I know this because I've explored all of the opportunities for the tool, right? Because I always ask myself, is there a faster way to do this? And 99% of the time there is. So like look for those opportunities, look for those areas where you can save time because you don't have a lot of time. And there's a lot that your professors ask you to do. So find ways to save time. And we'll do the same for the glazing. This case might be a little harder because there is gaps here. So one thing I could do, I guess, for now, I'm trying to think of a way to like save ultimate amounts of time on this. I would probably find a way, but in this case, I'd probably have to do this manually. Or what you can do is, there are tons of things you can do with this. Actually, I could do something in Illustrator that would help me with this, but anyway, we'll skip the glazing for now. You get the point. Okay, so now almost all of my masks are created. So let's start working with textures. So the way I work with textures is I like to stay abstract with my textures. I almost never bring in real world textures to represent things in my renderings. I like to stay abstract. So some of my favorite abstract textures are grunge textures. There's my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me if you want. So let's search for blue grunge texture. And the great thing about grunge textures is that they do a lot of the work for you. So they bring in a lot of variability that brings your renderings to life. So things are no longer flat. If I show you one of my favorite drawings, actually I can go in and just go to the presentation I'm making for tonight. And so for example, this render I did for a project that we were working on the TVA towers, there's tons of texture in here, right? And most of it is grunge. Like this is actually a real world sky. I found a really dope one, so I use it. But it's rare to find like real world textures that you use. So the ground here, also grunge texture. This drawing here is straight texture. It's actually like a Google Earth like rendering. So I just grabbed an image from Google Earth Street View and then used that. But the street views look terrible. So I did lots of work in Photoshop to bring that to life in terms of using textures, bringing in like an overlay of a dot matrix that I found that like really like helps that drawing along. So use textures to your advantage. And we'll talk about blend modes and stuff like that to where you can actually blend stuff together. So where were we? We were getting grunge textures. So let's find one that you think looks good. If you see one, let me know. Again, this is for the sky. If there was water, I'd also use blue grunge texture for the water. Like actually this one right here, use it all the time. Like in every drawing for water. I have another drawing where I use that exact texture for the water, which is like, okay, we'll stop with the show and tell soon. Show and tell's tonight at 6, so you should come. Let's turn off display mode high. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock, so we need to get going. So we can get back to studio. So not that one, this one. So that exact texture is what I use for the water here in various features. So it's one of my favorites. And a lot of these have these are not repeatable textures. So these are textures where you don't have to repeat it, but you can have it encompass the whole canvas and it's fine and it looks varied enough. But if you are looking for repeated textures, include the word seamless in your search for textures to find repeatable textures. So I'm gonna pick one and just make some modifications. This looks nice. We'll just pick it so we can get going. Let's do a road texture. So I'll just search for gray and I'll download multiple grays and use them. So gray grunge texture, nice. We'll use, this one's good. Okay, so now that I've got my textures, I'm going to now bring them into Photoshop and apply my masks to each one. So let's go ahead and start with the sky. So I'm going to bring in the blue sky texture. I'm going to place it. Now I'm going to scale it to fit the entire sky. Typically skies are they don't necessarily have to be strong elements in your drawings. The stronger they are, they typically distract from the actual drawing themselves. So I typically have them faded back, and it's okay for me to blow up this texture here so that it fits the entire sky versus creating a pattern, because it's not necessary for this texture to be super high resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this up to fit the sky here. And I'm just going to do this really quick. And then to transfer a mask from one layer to another, I'm just going to hold Alt, click on the mask, drag and drop it and place it, and then I'm done, right? So I don't have to copy or cut in the sky anymore. All of those textures have now been added, and all the work that I did to create the masks are now going to start paying off in terms of time savings later on, right? So you can still do all the normal edits that you would do normally. So you can go in and change the opacity, bring it back a bit, and now you have a nice soft background texture you can work with. So let's go ahead and create some other textures really fast here. So we'll bring in one of the gray textures for the front face of our panels here. So I'll also scale this, rotate it vertically. There are multiple transform features that we're going to use here. Some of my favorites are distort. Perspective is all right, but it's kind of finicky. But I like distort and warp, which come really handy. But in this case, we're just going to use distort. And I'll just bring in the corners of the texture to match the area that it's going to go in. And I'll have it be just a little bit bigger, just in case I want to make some changes than the actual front faces of the panels. Here, and I'll have this be exactly on the edge here. Same thing here. And I'm sort of kind of keeping with the perspective of the drawing, respecting the vanishing points that you see here. I'm going to hit enter. And then I'm going to go over to the mask for the panels, hold Alt again to copy the mask, bring it up, and then I'm done. So now the mask has clipped the texture to the exact area, and I don't have to cut it out again. So this is a way that you can save lots of time in your workflow when you're working with textures in Photoshop for use in your drawings. So let's do the same thing here with the ground. And then I'll show you some options here that you can use with creating highlights and shading in your drawing. So same process here. I'm not too worried about the resolution of the texture. Again, you can use textures to create patterns, which will work better for elements that need to be repeated. But I'm going to match the perspective of the ground here. And it's, kind of okay that it's kind of messy. I'm not super worried about that right now. So we'll just bring that down here. Then we're going to place the ground texture. Okay, now that's done. Great. I'm going to fade back the texture a little bit. Let's say we wanted to create in a paving pattern, right? So we're going to use one of our blend modes to achieve this. So I'm going to go into my texture library and grab in a rectangular grid. I'm going to bring this in, place it in, and I'm going to scale this and then distort it to fit, let's say, the concrete. So distort, I'll grab this here, grab this here. Okay. Now, ordinarily, what you might do is then say, okay, I need to get rid of the white, right? So you would probably go in and clip it out. Again, that's a destructive workflow. We're not going to use that method. Instead, we're going to use one of our blend modes. In fact, we're going to use multiply. And what multiply does is it gets rid of all the white in an image. And now I'll apply the ground mask to it. And so now I've done with it, basically. And in here, it's a little weird, but we could draw another line to represent the curb, or we can just use the mask to hide that portion of the paving pattern. So that's, again, using blending modes and masks together to achieve your result very quickly that you're looking for. Okay, so we'll fade that back a bit. All right, so let's talk about dodge and burn, which are two techniques that actually are taken from traditional photography. So in old school photography, when they would used to use dark rooms to develop photos, they would use techniques called dodge to add in highlights using a magnifying glass, and burn to add in shading to certain areas in a photo using a rubbing burn technique. So we're actually going to replicate that in Photoshop, and Photoshop has two tools that replicate that. So in order to prep for that, I'm going to create two layers here. I'm going to create dodge and burn. And I'm going to fill both layers with 50% gray. So I'm going to right click or draw, a full selection over the entire image, right click, fill with 50% gray. And do the same thing with the dodge. And then I'm going to select both layers and change their overlay or change their blend mode to overlay. And so now both of their blend modes are set to overlay, so that it looks like they went away, but the layers are still there. And with this method, now what I'm going to do is do a series of shading with the dodge and burn tool. So this magnifying glass right here is dodge, and the hand that looks like it's rubbing is burn. So I'm going to actually start with burn. I'm going to increase the size a bit here and just go in. Rule of thumb is contact areas between objects and edges of objects you typically burn or put shading on. And then the centers of objects you put highlights. So imagine placing a hand on a table with a light above you, right? The area right under the hand and where the hand contacts the desk, for example, that area should be shaded because it'll just be darker based on how light is reflecting off my hand. And the center of my hand would receive highlights. So same thing with your renderings. So areas that are underground or on the ground where elements are contacting should be dodged, or should be burned, for shading. And then areas towards the center of things you can highlight. So if I switch over to the dodge layer and switch the tool to dodge, I can go in with the brush and do some highlights in certain areas. So we can do the same thing here on the building facade. So doing highlights, and then go back to the burn layer and burn tool. I'm going to reduce the size of the brush. You can also use brackets to quickly reduce the size. So the left bracket makes your brush size smaller and the right bracket makes it bigger. And I can go in and burn contact areas of the panels as well. And let's say you wanted to do a quick line straight really quickly. You can actually click and then while holding shift, click again, and it'll actually create a line. It's kind of hard to see now. If I hide the background, you can see what we're doing here, right? So if I click over here, I can create the burn that we're looking for. So click, burn the edges, burn the centers of these. So this is a quick way to add in that shade and shadow around certain objects, which then allows it to really become punchy when you're working with it. So this is the fun part, right? This is where you can basically paint on your renders. So we can make it small. Let's say we wanted to grab in specific highlights like this. Click, hold shift, click, hold shift, click. So just to quickly show you the changes that we've made, if I click both of these layers and put them in a folder, and you can toggle them on and off. Let's bring the white back in. So you can see big changes as to how the render looks already. So let's talk about scale figures. So how to put scale figures in your drawings successfully so they match the proper scale of the render. So this is really important for making sure that you place people correctly. So I also have, I have a texture library where I use a lot of my textures in my drawings, but I also have a scale figure library. And I have versions for both with the real texture of the people and also a black and white version, which I created in Photoshop. I would just select everything and then make it black. So I have both versions for use in my drawings. So I'm going to drop in a few of these people. Scale them down a little bit just so they're not gigantic. Okay, so that object is placed. Let's do one more person. We use this guy. All right. So how do we place these people so they fit in our rendering correctly? One of the main important points when using or working with perspective renderings is the vanishing point and the horizon line. So in order to place these people in correctly, I need to line them up correctly in terms of the horizon line. And how do you find it in your drawing? So most likely the horizon line will be at the, or every time, the horizon line will be at the vanishing point. If it's, a normal flat render. Sometimes if you've got hills, it's a little different and that's a different story. But I'm going to hide these people super fast so I can find the horizon line. If you don't know where it is, if your drawing doesn't show it in particular, you can also just draw it by just creating a new layer, creating the pen tool, and then going in and draw in the vanishing point. So if you grab two corners here and you follow, and I'm using the hold shift command to do this. So hold shift and then continue that along. And then I'll do another up here. Okay, so now that I've lined up the vanishing point, I know that the vanishing point is somewhere over here. And I can place my horizon line there. And the goal is to ensure that, it'd actually be a little bit different if I delete that guy. There we go. So there's my vanishing point around there. So I'll place my guide where it needs to be, right there. And so I'm going to actually place the eyes of the scale figures on the vanishing point line. And no matter what size that they are, as long as their eyes are on the line, they'll look correct in terms of the perspective of the drawing. So if I grab these guys and hit Control T. Oh, is this guy on? Which layer is this on? I'll turn on auto select here. Okay, so let's scale them down. And I'm going to place their eyes on the horizon line. And so I know that wherever I place them, as long as their eyes are on the horizon line, they're at the correct scale that they need to be for the placement into the rendering. And in order to change where someone is, whether they're further back or closer to you, all you have to do is change their size. And that changes the placement of the individual in the rendering. So I'm just going to grab him. Make sure that your stroke is on a different layer. That'll help. And then we can just transform him. Place him where he needs to be. Okay, so now I know that these people are placed correctly. And I can go back in and hide the guide. And hide that stroke path. No longer need it. And I know my people are placed correctly. So that's how you place scale figures. Now let's say you need to place someone inside a building. That's when you need to use the vanishing points again. And the best way to do it would actually be to do a little bit of prep in Rhino beforehand. So because perspectives cannot be measured, you can guess how tall a person needs to be, for example, inside a window. So typically what I do is I put in a reference that is the height of an actual person. Then I can bring in the Photoshop person and use that reference as a way to scale them. So I'll actually create another vanishing point line that is about the height of that reference. That way I can then match up the scale figure to the height of that line. So it's basically like drawing another line that goes all the way to the vanishing point. So I know that if I follow that line, I can place people in the rendering at a certain height. So that's pretty much it in terms of just working really quickly and having that connection between Photoshop and Illustrator. So let's say I wanted to bring this into Illustrator. I'll hide the line work themselves. So all I have are the textures. I'll hit Control S to save. When it's done saving, go back to Illustrator. Illustrator will say, hey, do you want me to edit the changes? You'll click yes, and you'll see those changes be reflected. And so I've made some edits since the last one, but this is how you can quickly work and bounce back and forth between Illustrator and Photoshop to make your drawings. So I hope that helps a lot. Thanks for watching, everyone. There are more videos on the YouTube channel, so check those out. And there are more to come on many different programs that we're using today as designers. So see you soon.